This story is based on a real-life, true story. The bus rattled over the narrow country road, its old frame groaning under the strain of the uneven asphalt. Eliza Turner leaned back in her seat, staring out the fogged-up window at the world passing by. The village was just ahead, tucked away in the folds of the misty hills like a forgotten relic from another time. The landscape around her was haunting, each stretch of farmland empty and forlorn, the trees standing like silent sentinels against a sky that seemed perpetually grey. As the bus turned a sharp corner, the village finally came into view, a cluster of stone cottages draped in ivy, their chimneys curling smoke into the air. Hollowbrook. Eliza's fingers tightened around the leather straps of her bag. This was it, the place that would unlock the answers she had been seeking for years. Her sister's disappearance, so long ago, had never let her go, and now Hollowbrook was the key to unraveling the twisted thread that connected her to that dark past. The bus screeched to a halt at the small, moss-covered station. Eliza stood, stretching her long limbs as the door opened with a reluctant hiss. She stepped out into the cool, damp air, taking in the village's atmosphere. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Not a single person in sight, except for a couple of elderly figures leaning on walking sticks, staring at her with vacant, hollow eyes. The inn, according to the faded brochure she'd picked up at the last rest stop, was just down the road. She made her way there, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. A cold wind whipped through her hair, carrying with it a faint scent of damp earth and decay. The smell was familiar in an unsettling way, reminding her of old forests and forgotten graves. It set her nerves alight, but she pushed it down. No distractions. She was here for a reason. As she approached the inn, its weathered sign creaked in the breeze. The Hollowbrook Arms, a name that seemed far too on the nose. The building itself was large, but its presence was quietly oppressive, as if it had absorbed centuries of secrets within its wooden walls. Eliza could see through the cracked windows, dim, yellow light spilling out into the growing gloom of the evening. She knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman who could have been anywhere from 50 to 70. Her face was pale, marked by deep lines that carved through her skin like weathered riverbanks. There was something unreadable in her eyes, an unsettling calm that suggested she had seen far too much in her lifetime. Her mouth curved into a thin, tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're Eliza Turner?" the woman asked, in a voice that was soft but carried an edge of authority. Her accent was thick, the slow drawl of a country that had long since forgotten the rush of modernity. "Yes," Eliza replied, adjusting the strap of her bag, trying to suppress the flutter of unease that rose in her chest. "I have a reservation." The woman nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in then, Miss Turner. We've been expecting you." The inside of the inn was as much a reflection of the village outside as she could have imagined. Dusty wooden beams, a fire crackling in the hearth that cast long shadows across the room, and dark, antique furniture that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, mildew, and something else, something older. "I'm Margaret," the woman said, watching Eliza as she stepped into the dimly lit foyer. "I take it you're here for the research." Eliza nodded, swallowing the knot that had formed in her throat. "Yes, that's right. The disappearances, the folklore, everything." Margaret's eyes flicked to the side, then back to Eliza, her expression unreadable. "Some stories are best left buried, Miss Turner. This place has a way of claiming those who dig too deep." The words hung between them, a chill settling over the room that made Eliza's skin prickle. But she wasn't here to back down. The disappearances were part of her own story, the very thing that had shaped her into who she was. Unrelenting, driven by the need to understand what happened to her sister. She wouldn't be scared off. "I'm not afraid of stories," Eliza said, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask. "I'm here to find the truth." Margaret's lips twitched, as if the words amused her, but she didn't speak again. Instead, she led Eliza up the narrow staircase to a room at the far end of the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, as if the house itself were whispering to them. The room was small, its heavy curtains drawn against the fading light of the evening. A fireplace sat on one wall, its hearth cold. The furniture was old but comfortable enough, an iron-framed bed, a small writing desk, a rickety chair beside it. A single lamp flickered dimly on the nightstand, casting long shadows against the walls. "Your things will be brought up later. If you need anything, just call," Margaret said, standing in the doorway, her pale hand resting lightly on the frame. "Dinner's at 7. There's a small pub just down the road if you need some air." Eliza nodded, already unpacking the small bag she'd brought with her. She felt Margaret's gaze on her, heavy and strange, before the woman turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. Eliza stood in the middle of the room for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the village seemed to press against her, closing in around her like an invisible hand. She knew the history of this place, an old village, isolated and untouched by time, with rumors of strange occurrences and disappearances that went back centuries. People spoke in hushed tones about the Hollow Man, a figure that seemed to be woven into every whispered tale, every cryptic warning. As night fell and the firelight flickered, Eliza could feel the weight of those stories bearing down on her. She had heard about the Hollow Man, of course. The legend was known far beyond Hollowbrook. But here, now, standing on the threshold of it all, it felt more real. There was something in the air, something ancient, lingering, waiting. Eliza took a deep breath, reminding herself that she wasn't here to indulge in local superstition. She was here to uncover the truth. She was going to write the book that would expose the darkness hiding behind the village's idyllic facade. She had to. But as the night pressed on, the house creaked and groaned. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees in the forest. And for the first time in years, Eliza felt a creeping sense of dread. Something primal, something she couldn't ignore. Something was watching her. And it wasn't just the village. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. Eliza tossed and turned in her bed, the thin sheets tangled around her legs, her mind far from sleep. The wind outside howled, making the old house creak and groan like a living thing. But it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was something else. A feeling. A sense of being watched, as though the very walls of the inn had eyes, and every creak and whisper was a warning. She sat up, rubbing her temples as a shiver passed through her. She needed to shake off the unease, to remind herself why she was here. The truth was out there in Hollowbrook, buried beneath layers of time and fear, and she had come to uncover it. No one was going to stop her, not even a little unsettling tension in the air. Eliza swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cool floorboard sending a chill through her feet. She dressed quickly, grabbing her notebook and pen, then slipped out into the hallway. The inn was still quiet, the faint smell of wood smoke hanging in the air as she crept down the stairs. The downstairs pub was empty, save for the flickering light from the hearth. Margaret was behind the bar, polishing glasses with a cloth. She didn't seem surprised to see Eliza, though her lips curled into a tight smile. "Couldn't sleep?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but tinged with something knowing. Eliza nodded, taking a seat at the bar. I've never been good with silence. Margaret set down the glass and poured a drink from the dusty bottle behind her. Hollowbrook has a way of filling silence with other things. Things you can't quite place. The innkeeper's words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eliza didn't know if Margaret was speaking in riddles on purpose, or if the village had simply seeped into her speech, twisting her words. But either way, she felt the prickling sensation on her skin that told her this place wasn't as normal as it seemed. "I'm doing research," Eliza said, breaking the quiet. She wasn't entirely sure why she felt compelled to tell Margaret, but something about the woman's knowing stare made her want to. About the disappearances, the stories. People here don't like talking about it, do they? Margaret's eyes shifted to the crackling fire, her face growing distant for a moment. "There are things best left undisturbed," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Some truths can tear apart more than they reveal." Eliza leaned in, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What truths?" Margaret looked at her sharply, the soft mask of kindness slipping for a moment. "You'd do well to keep your distance from the past, Miss Turner. Hollowbrook has a way of claiming what belongs to it." Eliza frowned, confused and irritated. "But I'm here to uncover the truth, not run away from it." The older woman's lips twitched, her expression unreadable. "The truth always comes at a price. People who seek it don't always walk away unscathed." Before Eliza could respond, the door to the inn opened, the sound of it creaking loudly in the silence of the room. A man stepped in, a tall figure, his face shadowed under the brim of a weathered cap. His coat was heavy, a dark woolen thing that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. He glanced around and his eyes landed on Eliza. "Didn't expect a visitor so late," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Eliza met his gaze, a spark of recognition lighting up inside her. He wasn't from Hollowbrook, not by the look of him. He had the air of someone who didn't quite belong, someone just passing through. But there was something else, a strange, almost predatory energy to him. "I'm Eliza Turner," she introduced herself, trying to sound casual, but the back of her neck prickled. "I'm here researching the disappearances." The man didn't seem surprised. In fact, he gave a half smile that was both unsettling and cold. "Of course you are," he said, his voice carrying a faint irony. He set down a leather satchel on the counter, and Margaret gave him a short nod. "You're one of them," Eliza said, more to herself than to him. She had seen the way the locals had recoiled when she mentioned her purpose. There was something deeply ingrained in the town's blood, a fear that ran deeper than the folklore itself. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a seat next to her, his movements deliberate and slow, like a predator sizing up its prey. "People in Hollowbrook don't like to talk," Eliza continued, keeping her voice level, though the unease was thick in the pit of her stomach. "And it's obvious they want me to leave. Why? What are they hiding?" The man finally spoke, his voice rough with the weight of experience. "You've asked the wrong questions, Miss Turner. You're digging into things that don't belong to you." Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but a chill ran through her, one that wasn't just from the cool air or the stone walls of the inn. There was something in the man's gaze that made her uneasy, a flicker of something cold and ancient, something that didn't quite fit with the world outside this village. "The Hollow Man," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The stories, they're real, and they don't take kindly to outsiders poking around." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The Hollow Man, the thing from the old legends. She had heard the name mentioned in passing, in hushed voices, But to hear it spoken like this, with such finality and warning, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Before she could ask anything further, the man stood and pulled his satchel over his shoulder, moving toward the door. "Be careful, Miss Turner," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Some truths are worse than the lies." And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving Eliza sitting in stunned silence. Margaret, who had been watching the entire exchange with an unreadable expression, finally spoke. "You'll see him again," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "And when you do, you'll understand what I mean." The door clicked shut behind the stranger, and Eliza was left with the unsettling feeling that the village's secrets were far darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. The Hollow Man wasn't just a story. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for her. She felt it in the very air around her, in the heavy silence that pressed against her chest. She had come to Hollowbrook to uncover the truth, but she had no idea how deeply it would reach into her soul, or how far it would go to keep its secrets hidden. The day broke cold and heavy, the fog that had settled over Hollowbrook thickening as the sun rose, weak and shrouded in mist. Eliza stood by the inn's window, staring out at the blurred outlines of the cottages and the dark silhouette of the forest beyond. It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed to move, where the village appeared frozen in time. Hollowbrook felt like a place untouched by daylight, suspended in some eerie moment of dusk. She had spent most of the night reading the journal she'd discovered in the library. The brittle pages, yellowed with age, had spoken of a terrifying truth, one that Eliza hadn't been ready to face. The Hollow Man was no mere legend. He was something older, something woven into the very fabric of the village. The journal's author had written frantically as though he were trying to escape an inevitable fate, detailing his growing terror as he realized that the Hollow Man wasn't just a spectral figure, he was a force that fed on fear, on those who dared to uncover the village's darkest secret. As Eliza flipped through the pages again, she found herself drawn to the description of a ritual, a blood-bound pact made centuries ago between the village's founding families and an ancient force that resided in the forest. It was a deal struck to protect Hollowbrook from a plague, a famine, or some other unimaginable horror, but the price had been steep. The Hollow Man, a shape-shifting entity bound by dark magic, had been set free to roam the woods and the village itself, claiming the souls of those who dared to disturb the peace. And now Eliza had come here, unwittingly treading the same path as those who had disappeared before her, drawn by the same insatiable hunger for answers. She closed the journal with a soft, despairing thud. The truth was more terrible than she had ever imagined. Hollowbrook wasn't just a village lost to time, it was cursed, and she was at the center of it, just as her sister had been all those years ago. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Eliza's heart skipped. She hadn't been expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and opened it to reveal Daniel, the historian she'd met the day before. His face was drawn, his eyes dark with an unspoken urgency. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "It's not safe for you to be here. Not anymore." Eliza's pulse quickened. She had seen Daniel before, his quiet demeanor, his attempts to distance himself from the town's more disturbing history. But now there was something different about him. A kind of panic in his eyes that made her stomach turn. "What's going on?" Eliza asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel glanced toward the door as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You've stirred something. The Hollow Man, the curse, whatever you want to call it. He's been waiting for someone to come poking around for years. And now that you're here, he trailed off, his face pale. You're a threat. You're in danger. I'm in danger? Eliza's tone was incredulous. You've got to be kidding me. I'm here to... I know what you're here for, Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. But you don't get it. People have been disappearing for generations. You think it's just some strange coincidence? Some dark legend? Number this place. It draws in the curious, the ones with questions. And when they find out too much... He broke off, his fists clenched at his sides. Eliza stepped closer, her curiosity overpowering the rising sense of fear. What do you know about my sister? You said yesterday there were other disappearances. Was she one of them? Daniel hesitated, a flicker of something darker passing over his face. He didn't want to tell her, that much was obvious, but the urgency in his eyes seemed to push him past the point of silence. Your sister, he began carefully, his voice low, wasn't just lost, she was chosen by the Hollow Man. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Chosen? What do you mean? He took a step back, as if preparing to flee from the words he was about to say. It's part of the curse. Every so often, someone who dares to learn the truth becomes a vessel, an offering. The Hollow Man, he needs them to feed. He doesn't just take their lives, he takes their souls, their very essence. They become part of him. And when your sister disappeared, she became just another piece of the puzzle, another soul for him to claim. Eliza's mind whirled. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This was about something far more horrifying than she had ever imagined. Her sister, the woman she had been desperately searching for all these years, was not simply gone. She had been taken, sacrificed as part of the very curse that had bound Hollowbrook in its grip for centuries. How do you know this? Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. How do you know all of this? Daniel's eyes darkened, his face twisting in guilt and fear. Because I've been studying it. I've been looking into the curse for years, trying to find a way to break it. But there's no way out, Eliza. The Hollow Man is too powerful. He can't be stopped by normal means. And those who try to stop him end up like the rest. Lost. Taken. Eliza's chest tightened, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The realization sank in cold and suffocating. She had come here to solve a mystery, to write a book, to gain closure. But now she saw it all, the price she would pay, the cost of the truth she had been seeking. And the worst part was, it wasn't just her sister who had suffered. Eliza looked at Daniel, her hands trembling. What happens if I can't stop it? What happens to me? Daniel's expression faltered, a grim pity settling in his eyes. You're already in it, Eliza. The moment you stepped foot into this village, you sealed your fate. The Hollow Man has already sensed you. He knows you're here. And he will come for you, just as he's come for the others. Eliza's mind raced, her breath quickening. There has to be something we can do. There has to be a way to stop him. Daniel shook his head, his face pale with fear. I've tried everything. I've gone through every old text, every myth and legend. But the truth is, the curse is stronger than any of us. The Hollow Man can't be fought. He can't be reasoned with. He feeds on fear on those who get too close. And once you're caught in his web, there's no escape. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the weight of them pressing down on Eliza's chest. She had no choice but to ask the next question, even though she feared the answer. Is there a way to end it? To stop the curse, once and for all? Daniel's face tightened, his jaw clenching as if even considering it was painful. There's a ritual, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. A ritual that's said to banish him, but it's dangerous. If it's performed incorrectly, If you don't follow every step, the consequences could be worse than you can imagine. People have tried, and they've failed. Eliza stared at him, her mind racing. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She wasn't ready to accept the fate Daniel seemed so certain of. "I have to try," she said, her voice cold with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Daniel shook his head, but there was nothing he could say to stop her. She was already committed to this path, just as her sister had been before her. The Hollow Man was coming, and Eliza was ready to face him. The forest surrounding Hollowbrook was a place of ancient shadows. Eliza had heard whispers about it in town, and she'd read warnings in the journal she'd found, warnings that spoke of the woods as if they were alive, as though they held something far darker than trees and dirt within their depths. People rarely ventured in, not unless they were desperate or cursed. The trees grew thick and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness, a sense of being watched, of being hunted. Eliza stood at the edge of the forest, her heart hammering in her chest. The wind had picked up, sending an eerie rustling through the leaves, but it did nothing to break the overwhelming silence that seemed to hang over the woods. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She had to do this. Daniel's warning still echoed in her ears. "You're already in it, Eliza. The moment you stepped foot into this village, you sealed your fate." But she didn't care about fate anymore. She had come too far to back down, and if this was the only way to uncover the truth, then she would face whatever awaited her in the dark heart of the forest. With one last steadying breath, Eliza crossed the threshold of the trees. The instant she stepped into the forest, the temperature dropped. A chill seeped through her coat, crawling under her skin. The air tasted faintly of damp earth and decay. She pulled the collar of her coat tighter, but the feeling of being surrounded by eyes, the sense that the forest itself was watching her, was impossible to shake. She had come to the forest to find the Hollow Man, or perhaps to make him find her. The journey was slow, each step heavy with the weight of her purpose. The underbrush was thick, tangled with vines that seemed to pull at her legs as if urging her to turn back. The deeper she went, the darker the forest became, the trees pressing closer together, blocking out the weak light of the overcast sky. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of crows, their cries sounding like voices on the wind. Eliza's breath quickened as the oppressive silence weighed down on her. Every crack of a branch, every shift in the wind made her jump. She wasn't alone. The forest itself seemed to breathe, alive with an unseen presence. It was as though something ancient, something dark, was drawing her deeper into its embrace. She paused for a moment, listening. There were footsteps behind her, soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The trees stood silent, unmoving, as if mocking her. "You're losing your mind," she told herself. "Focus. Stay calm." The deeper she walked, the more the sensation of being watched intensified. And then, just as she thought she might lose her resolve entirely, she saw it. A clearing ahead where the trees seemed to part, forming a large, circular space. The ground was uneven, the earth churned up as if something large had moved through here recently. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar. It was ancient, covered in moss and lichen, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She had seen this altar in the journal, the ritual site. The place where the Hollow Man's bargain had been sealed, where the sacrifices had been made. She could feel the power radiating from it, a strange, dark energy that pulsed through the air like the thrum of a distant heartbeat. This was it. Eliza stepped forward, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, questions, fear, and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. She had read about the ritual, but there were no guarantees. There was no way to know if it would work, or if she was simply walking into the mouth of a trap. As she approached the altar, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, sending a shower of leaves swirling around her. The air was thick with anticipation, and Eliza could almost feel the eyes of the forest upon her, waiting for her next move. Then she heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. Her heart froze in her chest as the voice seemed to come from all directions, circling her, wrapping around her like a snake. "Eliza, Eliza, come to me." The voice was soothing, yet filled with an unnerving hunger. She froze, the blood in her veins turning to ice. The hollow man. She could feel his presence now, a palpable force in the air, reaching for her. His voice was the voice of the forest itself, deep and echoing, resonating in her bones. She spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The clearing was still. The trees were silent. Only the wind howled. "Eliza!" The voice came again, closer this time, as if it were right behind her. Her pulse raced. She knew she had to act now, or she would be lost to whatever had claimed all those before her. She pulled out the small bundle of items Daniel had given her, the herbs, the candles, the bloodstone, everything she would need to perform the ritual. Her hands shook as she placed the bloodstone on the altar and lit the candles, the flame flickering erratically in the wind, casting long, twisted shadows on the stone. The voice was growing louder, more insistent, its whisper now a low growl, reverberating through her chest. "Eliza, you cannot escape me. You belong to me." She forced herself to focus, ignoring the oppressive weight of his words, the way the forest seemed to bend and twist around her. She could feel him now, the hollow man, his presence so close she could almost touch it. She took a deep breath and began to speak the words from the journal, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. The ancient language of the ritual. She felt the air crackle with energy as she recited the incantation, her words building in intensity. The wind howled around her, the trees shaking as though they were alive, as if they too were responding to the ritual. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a brief moment, Eliza thought she saw something. A shadow in the corner of her eye. A shape, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth that opened impossibly wide. The hollow man, but she couldn't stop now. She continued, her voice rising, her hands trembling, as she completed the final phrase of the incantation. The forest fell silent. For a moment, Eliza thought it was over, that the hollow man had retreated, that the ritual had worked. But as the silence stretched on, she realized something was wrong. The wind had stopped, the trees were still, and the air, it felt heavier than before, thick with dread. And then she saw it. The hollow man was standing before her, his tall, twisted form emerging from the shadows of the trees. His skin was a mottled greyish-brown, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were empty sockets, and his mouth hung open wide, filled with teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. His shape shifted as he moved, his form blurring at the edges, as if he were made of smoke or shadow. He was no longer just a myth. He was real. "Eliza!" The voice was not the wind now. It came from the hollow man himself, low and guttural, filled with hunger. "You are mine." She stood frozen for a moment, terror rooting her to the spot. The ritual had failed. The Hollow Man was here, and there was no escaping him now. But then she remembered the bloodstone, the words, the rituals. This wasn't over, not yet. The Hollow Man was standing just a few feet from Eliza now, his shape wavering in the dim light like a shadow that refused to settle. He was no longer the figure of legend, the spectral force whispered about in hushed voices. No, now he was flesh, a nightmare made real. His skin seemed to ripple, as if his body wasn't entirely solid, and the air around him was thick with an unnatural chill that made Eliza's breath come in shallow gasps. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for the briefest moment, Eliza felt her heart stop. It wasn't just his eyes that frightened her. There was something in the very air around him, an oppressive, suffocating darkness that seemed to choke her very soul. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something deeper, more primal, a pull that threatened to drown her. "Eliza," the voice came again, but it was no longer a whisper in the wind. It was as if it came from within her, reverberating through her chest. "I've been waiting for you. For so long." The words slithered into her mind, cold and wet. She could almost feel the weight of them pressing down on her thoughts, wrapping around her like a coil. The Hollow Man knew her name. He knew everything about her. The fact that she had come to Hollowbrook, the fact that she sought answers. He had been waiting for someone like her to arrive, someone who would dare disturb the ancient curse. And now he was ready to claim her. Eliza stumbled back, her breath ragged. She reached for the bloodstone, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the stone she had placed on the altar. The ritual had failed, but there had to be another way. She had read about the bloodstone in the journal. It was supposed to hold power, protection against the curse, a means to bind the Hollow Man back into the forest. She had to use it, but the terror that gripped her made it hard to think clearly. The Hollow Man's presence loomed closer, his form distorting and reforming with every step, his mouth stretching open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of teeth too sharp to be real. "You don't understand," he growled, his voice now low and thick, almost like a growl. "You were never meant to escape. You're part of this village now. You always were. Your sister's soul, her essence, belongs to me, and now yours will join hers." Eliza's mind raced, the fear gnawing at her insides, but she couldn't let it consume her. She wouldn't let it. She had come for answers. She had come to end this. The bloodstone pulsed in her hand as if it recognized her resolve. Her fingers curled around it, and she stepped forward, despite the gut-wrenching fear clawing at her chest. "I won't let you have me," Eliza spat, her voice trembling but fierce. The Hollow Man's mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin, the air around him rippling with malicious energy. "You don't get to choose, Eliza. You're already mine. The moment you set foot in this place, you made your decision. You think you can fight me?" Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She was running out of time. He was too close, too powerful. She had to do something. Remembering the journal, Eliza forced herself to recall the final steps of the ritual, the ancient words she had read, the incantation that had bound the Hollow Man to this cursed land. It was her only chance. She had to say the words aloud, even though the Hollow Man's proximity made her stomach twist, his very presence making the air thick and suffocating. Her mind ached as she forced the words from the journal to the surface, her tongue unfamiliar with the syllables, the language older than time itself. She didn't know if it would work, if she could even make it through the chant, but she had to try. The Hollow Man's laughter echoed through the forest, the sound of it scraping against her soul, tearing at her resolve. "You think your petty rituals can save you. You are already part of me. The curse will never end. Not for you, not for anyone." But Eliza refused to stop. She spoke faster, the words tumbling from her lips, desperate and furious. She could feel the bloodstone growing warmer in her hand, the air around her rippling with energy, but still the hollow man moved closer, too close. His breath, hot and foul, brushed against her skin. Then, just as the words of the incantation were nearly out, a sharp, overwhelming sensation swept over Eliza. The forest seemed to fold in on her, the shadows thickening, swirling like smoke. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, thrumming in her ears, the hollow man's voice melding with the wind. "You are mine. You cannot escape." Her body trembled as the energy from the stone surged through her, but it wasn't enough. The shadows were too powerful. She could feel herself slipping, like her very soul was being pulled from her body, drawn into the void that hovered just beneath the surface of the forest. The hollow man was too strong, too ancient. And then she saw it. From the corner of her eye, she saw a faint flicker, a figure moving in the distance. Eliza's heart skipped. Could it be her sister? She hadn't seen her sister's face in years, not since the day she had disappeared, but there she was, her outline blurred by the shadows, standing just beyond the trees. Eliza's breath hitched, her heart pounding. She couldn't tell if it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of the hollow man's power, but the figure was beckoning to her, its arms outstretched. Eliza. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. "You can still save me." Her sister's voice, barely a whisper on the wind. "Save her? How?" the hollow man snarled, sensing her hesitation. "She's gone, Eliza. She's one of mine now. There's no saving her. Or yourself." The figure flickered again, fading in and out of existence, the shadows stretching around it like dark tendrils. And then, just as Eliza thought she might lose her grip on reality, the bloodstone in her hand flared brightly, an intense, blinding light filling the clearing. It was as though the stone had absorbed all the power of the incantation, pushing back against the hollow man's influence. "Eliza!" The voice of her sister grew fainter, more distant. "Please end it! End the curse!" The hollow man let out a terrible scream, his form distorting in agony as the light from the stone pulsed in rhythm with Eliza's heartbeat. The ground beneath her feet began to crack and shift as the energy of the ritual swirled, the ritual finally taking hold. The force of it nearly knocked Eliza off her feet, but she held on tight, pushing through the terror that threatened to consume her. With one final desperate cry, she screamed the last word of the incantation. The hollow man howled, a sound like thunder tearing through the air. And then, silence. The clearing fell still. The shadows, once thick and oppressive, began to fade, retreating into the trees. The wind stopped howling, and the chill in the air began to lift. Eliza staggered back, gasping for air, her hand still gripping the bloodstone as though her life depended on it. She looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The forest was still, unnaturally so, the oppressive weight that had once hung in the air, now gone. And yet, as she looked back at the place where her sister's figure had stood, she found nothing but an empty clearing, the shadows now receding into the trees. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. Had it worked? Had she freed her sister? Or had she, in some terrible way, made things worse? The answer was elusive, the fear still lingering in the back of her mind like a shadow waiting to strike again. But for now, she had survived. For now, the hollow man was gone. At least, that's what she hoped. And as she turned to leave the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. Eliza staggered out of the forest, the faint, lingering echoes of the hollow man's presence still rippling in the air. The daylight had barely changed since she entered the woods, the sky still overcast and muted. It was as though time had stalled, frozen in place by the force that had been unleashed within the forest. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. She looked over her shoulder one last time, her pulse quickening as a chill skittered down her spine. The trees loomed dark and silent, their twisted branches reaching toward her as if to pull her back. But the Hollow Man, at least for now, was gone. She had felt him slip away, fading into the ether with the final words of the ritual. Or so she hoped. But doubt gnawed at her, a relentless presence at the back of her mind. Was it really over? Had she truly stopped him, or had she simply delayed the inevitable? There had been something about the Hollow Man's scream, something primal and full of rage, that made her wonder if there was more to the curse than even the journal had revealed. If there was something darker still waiting, something that could never truly be vanquished. Eliza. The voice cut through the thick silence, soft and distant, but unmistakably clear. Her heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, her breath catching. The clearing behind her was empty, the forest eerily silent. There was no sign of the Hollow Man. Yet the voice, faint but unmistakable, had come from the direction of the forest. Eliza. It was her sister's voice. She could hear it in the way it trembled, the way it called her name, just as it had in the clearing. She had to be imagining it. Had to be. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the voice stopped. Eliza stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The wind picked up once more, a soft whisper that seemed to call her back into the woods. Her sister's presence, the faint touch of her voice, lingered in the air like a phantom, an echo of something unfinished, something left unresolved. She had to know. Despite every instinct telling her to turn away, to walk as far from the forest as possible, Eliza found herself heading back. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn back into the darkness she had just escaped. Her mind, consumed by uncertainty, by the haunting pull of the voice, could not resist. As she made her way back toward the forest, the landscape seemed to shift subtly around her. The village, which had seemed so distant just moments ago, now felt suffocatingly close. The houses on the outskirts appeared hollow, their windows staring blankly at her as though they were aware of her every step. Hollowbrook itself felt off, strange, foreign, as if it were changing shape before her eyes. The feeling of eyes upon her was growing again, and she couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something was not quite right. She couldn't tell if it was the village or if it was her, whether she was losing her grip on reality or whether something truly had changed. The Hollow Man had been real, and she had felt the weight of his darkness. Had the ritual really been enough to sever that link, or had she simply stirred the hornet's nest? By the time Eliza reached the edge of the forest, the voice called to her again, this time louder, more insistent. Eliza! Her name echoed through the trees, a soft, sorrowful plea. She stood at the threshold of the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with fog again, rolling off the ground in tendrils, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. Every part of her screamed to turn back, to leave this place, but the pull was undeniable. The voice, it felt so real, her sister's voice calling from the depths of the forest. Without thinking, Eliza stepped forward. The fog swallowed her whole, and for a moment she was surrounded by nothing but a grey mist that seemed to close in on her. Every step she took felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet soft and uneven. The branches of the trees reached down, low and twisted, as if to pull her further into their gnarled embrace. "Eliza!" The voice came again. This time it was unmistakable, not a whisper, but a clear, urgent cry, so close that Eliza's heart skipped in fear. "Please, help me!" Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out, to say something, to respond to the voice, but her throat was tight, as though something was choking her from the inside. The forest seemed to close in around her, the sound of her pulse louder in her ears than the wind, than the voice. The trees, once distant, now loomed above her, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The deeper she walked, the more the air around her seemed to warp, distorting her perception of reality. The woods felt alive, thrumming with something unseen, something watching her. It wasn't just the Hollow Man anymore, this was something else. The voice led her through the forest, guiding her with its sorrowful plea, "Help me! Help me!" It repeated, louder now, full of fear and desperation. Eliza pushed forward, her mind teetering between the hope that she might find her sister and the ever-growing dread that this was a trap, that she was walking into something far worse than she could comprehend. She reached a small clearing, and there, at the center, she saw it. A figure crouched on the ground, its back turned to her. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. She had to reach her sister. She had to. "Eliza!" Her sister's voice, weak but unmistakable. The figure turned slowly, and Eliza felt her breath catch as her sister's face came into view. But it wasn't the woman she remembered. Her sister's eyes were hollow, dark pits where nothing remained. Her skin was grey and stretched too tightly over her bones, her lips cracked into a sickly grin. "Eliza, you came back for me." Her sister's voice was low, barely audible as she rose from the ground, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Eliza staggered back, her heart hammering in her chest as the truth settled in with horrifying clarity. This wasn't her sister, not anymore. This was something that had taken her, something that had become her. The Hollow Man's curse wasn't just about taking souls, it was about replacing them. The voice that had called to Eliza, that had pulled her back into the forest, had been a lie, a trap. Her sister's voice had been twisted, corrupted, to lure Eliza into the depths of the forest. And now there was no escape. "Eliza!" the creature rasped, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "You should have never come. You should have never asked questions." The forest closed in around her as the creature took a step forward, its shadow expanding to consume everything. The Hollow Man's curse had claimed another soul, and this time there was no escape.